Hello Brain Shakers, welcome to the Brain Shakers Academy. Brave Alice is here. In today's session, we're going to be looking at the coagulation cascade, also referred to as the clotting mechanism. Now, this is part of the hematopoietic system where we will be looking at an interplay of clotting factors to come to the formation of that clot that we often see. Now, let's quickly dive into today's session and see how a clot is going to be formed. So there are basically two main pathways in which a clot can be formed. One is referred to as the extrinsic pathway, and the other one is referred to as the intrinsic pathway. So if we did put the intrinsic pathway here, so we are going to have an intrinsic pathway, and on the other end, we are going to have what we will refer to as an extrinsic pathway. So basically, an intrinsic pathway, this is what is happening within the circulatory system. An extrinsic pathway is what is happening outside the circulatory system, influencing the clotting factors and the functionality of the circulatory system. Now, let's start with the intrinsic system. But before we look at the intrinsic system, suffice also to mention that the intrinsic and the extrinsic will then later have what we refer to as a common pathway, because they will all then reach a stage where they will activate the prothrombin activator. Now, if we're looking at the intrinsic pathway, the intrinsic pathway is normally activated when there is endothelial damage. So one of the commonest causes for the intrinsic pathway to be activated is endothelial damage. Okay, so any insult to the endothelium or any damage to the endothelium is going to then activate the intrinsic pathway. Now, what does the endothelium do? Within the circulatory system, you have an endothelium, and the endothelium that is lining all those blood vessels is making sure every time that the blood that is flowing through it does not clot. So when it is damaged, it means that it then exposes a special type of clotting factor that we refer to as the Hedgeman's clotting factor, or that we call the Hedgeman factor. Okay, now this Hedgeman factor is what we refer to as clotting factor number 12. Now, if there is endothelial damage, this is then going to be exposed. But what is it being exposed to? It is going to be exposed to collagen, and will also be exposed to the HMWK, what we call a kininogen, okay, component. So this is just high molecular weight kininogen. So the factor 12 is then exposed to these elements, and because of the exposure of that factor to these elements, it will then be converted from its inactive form to an active form. So we already know what is causing the endothelial damage, so we can get rid of these things here. So we have our factor 12 here, which then has been exposed, and then will be transformed into its active form, which is going to be factor 12A. Then factor 12A is then going to convert factor 11 into factor 11A. Okay, so once the factor 11A has then been formed, so we can put an arrow here that this is what is facilitating that. And then when you look at factor 11A, it will then convert or facilitate the transformation or activation of not factor 10, but factor 9. So it will be factor 9 that will then be transformed into factor 9A. Because factor 11A has no capacity to change factor 10 into factor 10A, it skips factor 10 and then converts factor 9 into factor 9A. Now, factor 9A will then bind to what we refer to as calcium. So it works with calcium. Now, as it works with calcium, so you are going to have calcium here, and as it works with calcium, it will then form a complex that will have the capacity of converting factor 10 into factor 10A. Okay, so that complex will then now help in the conversion of factor 10 into factor 10A. Now, when factor 10A has been generated, factor 10A is considered a prothrombin activator, an active form that then has the capacity to change prothrombin from its inactive form to its active form, which is known as the thrombin. So, this factor 10A is then going to convert prothrombin, okay, prothrombin into its active form called thrombin. Now, prothrombin is just a clotting of factor 2, okay? So this factor 10A will then act on the prothrombin because it's a prothrombin activator. So it converts the prothrombin into thrombin. Now, at the same time that it produces thrombin, thrombin now comes in and plays a key role in the conversion of what we call factor 8 into factor 8A. So there's going to be factor 8, okay, which is going to be converted into factor 8A. Now, this is what we call a stabilizing factor. So it is known as a stabilizing factor. Okay, and it comes as an influence of the production of thrombin there, converting it from its inactive form into its active form, so that once the clot has then been formed, the stabilizing factor will come in now and make sure that it stabilizes the clot, so that the clot is then going to be there and then allow for the agglutination of those platelets. Now, thrombin, which is the active form of clotting factor 2, is then going to convert a factor 1, which is fibrinogen, into fibrin. Okay, so this thrombin again is going at the same time going to convert fibrinogen into the fibrin. So the fibrin now is what is going to form that clot that we see, because in the presence of thrombin, the fibrinogen has been converted into fibrin, and then you have that fibrin. The stabilization factor then comes into play with its calcium as well, comes in on this clot here, and then stabilizes the clot and makes sure that it forms those strands. So there will be fibrin strands. So this fibrin is going to make sure that it's stabilized now by the stabilizing factor, and you have all those fibrin strands that will then form. So you have all your platelets now agglutinating there, and then a clot is going to form. Now, from the 10th factor here, from the 10th clotting factor here, this part here, all the way to the formation of the clot, is what is referred to as a common pathway, because whether the clotting mechanism has been initiated by the extrinsic pathway or it has been initiated by the intrinsic pathway, it will still come up with this last part of the clotting mechanism. So that is how a clot is then going to be generated through the intrinsic pathway. Now, let's quickly look at what happens with the extrinsic pathway. So the extrinsic pathway is going to be initiated when you have tissue damage. If you have any injury on the skin, you have any injury on any other part of your body that is outside the circulatory system, then the clotting mechanism that will be initiated will be the extrinsic pathway. Now, if you have an intrauterine fetal death, there is a tissue thromboplastin that is also going to be elicited from there, and so that can then generate the extrinsic pathway because you're out of the intravascular space, and then you may end up with a condition that we call a DIC, which is just disseminated intravascular coagulation. And in most cases, that's why if you have an intrauterine fetal death, you do not want to keep that dead fetus in utero for a long period of time for fear of the generation of the extrinsic pathway. So we're saying that the extrinsic pathway then is going to be generated because of tissue damage. So we are saying that you can have tissue damage here, and then you can also have tissue thromboplastin being released. Now, when this has happened, it means that there is going to be activation of what we call the tissue factor, and the tissue factor is factor 3. So we'll have the inactive form being converted into its active form, which is 3A. And then you will also have at the same time the activation of factor 7 into factor 7A. So you're going to have a factor 7 here being activated into factor 7A. Now, the tissue factor together with factor 7A in the presence of calcium is then going to convert factor 10 into factor 10A. So factor 10 will then be converted into factor 10A because they now form a complex. So this complex that they form will then be able to get factor 10A converted into factor 10 to get converted into its active form as a factor 10A. Now, the factor 10A will still be working with calcium there, okay? So as it works with the calcium, it's still forming a complex. And we did make mention when we looked at the intrinsic pathway that the factor 10A is a prothrombin activator, meaning that at the same time that it works with the calcium, it will then come and then activate the prothrombin here, which is factor 2, and change it from its inactive form to its active form, which is going to be thrombin. Now, when you have the thrombin is already having the capacity to convert factor 8 into factor 8A, which we call the stabilizing factor. So that stabilizing factor will come in once the thrombin has converted the fibrinogen into fibrin or fibrinogen A. So the fibrin that is then going to form will then form all those strands. And as it forms those strands, you will have your platelets there agglutinating. Platelets are thrombocytes, which are cells that will be circulating in the system and will help also in the formation of that clot. And this stabilizing factor is what is going to make sure that the clot that has then been formed is going to hold. So that is the extrinsic pathway, and this is the intrinsic pathway. Now, as the clot or coagulation cascade begins, the process also of dissolution of this clot would have begun. In the body, there is another element that is going to be circulating that we refer to as plasminogen. So you already have a plasminogen there. Now, plasminogen will have to be activated by what we call the TPA or the TPF. So this is tissue plasminogen activator or tissue plasminogen factor. So this will convert the plasminogen from its inactive form into its active form that we call the plasmin. Now, it is the role of plasmin working with other components to then come and digest that clot that would have formed. Once everything has been rectified, then the plasmin will start the process of fibrinolysis, which is just to digest those fibrin strands that had formed during the process of clotting mechanism. So basically that is what is happening in the coagulation pathway or in the coagulation cascade. The formation of a clot can happen through intrinsic and the extrinsic pathway, and at the same time the fibrinolytic pathway as well is into play, meaning that all the structures would already be circulating in the system and ready to take course. And that's why you notice that if you have a cut on your skin, after a few days of that clot forming, even if you do not tamper with it, that clot is going to begin to disappear. Why? Because of the fibrinolytic pathway that is already in play. Now, if you found this particular video interesting and helpful in understanding the coagulation cascade, or you have questions, drop those questions in the comments section. I would like to hear from you. And as always, please remember to share this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is the Brain Shakers Academy. And from me, thank you so much for watching and for all the support. And I will see you in the next one.